This week on the Retirement Quick Tips podcast, I'm sharing with you some interesting articles I've been reading, hopefully useful for you. And today I'm talking about a new retirement withdrawal recommendation out from Morningstar that suggests a 3.7% withdrawal rate in the first year of retirement. Very, very specific. They've been doing this going back a few years. Actually, Morningstar started releasing their safe withdrawal rate report in 2021. So they've been doing it a few years, and it was 3.3% back then. Then in 2022, it was 3.8%. Then last year, it was 4%, and now it's back down to 3.7%. And while I don't think you have to adhere to this with, like a religious fervor, about I can only take 3.7%. That's not true. But it is a nice guideline, but it's important. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to dig a little bit deeper and kind of explain where this recommended withdrawal rate comes from and some things that you can take away from it that you can apply to your own situation to decide, well, should I maybe take less than that? Should I take a little bit more than that? Would that be safe as well? Last year, again, it was 4%. It's down to 3.7%. So the first question here is, well, why the change? Well, it was lowered because of the lower return assumptions going forward for the next 30 years for stocks, bonds, and cash. So if you're retiring today, Morningstar, in recommending this safe withdrawal rate, has to use some assumptions. And those assumptions change from year to year. And the assumptions with the reduced returns compared to last year have to do simply with a couple of things. One is higher equity valuations. In other words, we've had 2 years in a row where stocks have gone up more than 20%. So stocks are looking pretty expensive and potentially due for a correction or a major correction. And if that happens in the early years of retirement, especially in the first couple of years, that can be very, very damaging. So if you're wanting to be conservative, make sure that you give yourself the highest chance of not running out of money. And if you're planning to retire this year or next year, I would take that advice, or I would take that into consideration. The fact that stocks have marched up pretty considerably without much of a hiccup, except for 2022 over the last several years. I'll talk actually more about that tomorrow. The other assumption is that compared to last year, bond returns are lower. The Fed has started reducing interest rates. Bond yields and returns that you could get on bonds were higher last year compared to this year. So lower stock return expectations, I should say, lower bond return expectations are contributing to that slightly lower 3.7% recommended withdrawal rate. Now, what's important to understand about this, one of the other assumptions that's used is, what is the portfolio made up of? It's actually a pretty conservative portfolio that they're using as an assumption in the withdrawal rate. The underlying portfolio is holding between 20% and 50% in stocks, and the remainder is in bonds and cash. So that's a pretty conservative portfolio at the outset of retirement, especially for someone who's 60, 65 years old. Typically for my own clients, all else being equal, we would have them a bit higher than that, maybe 60, 65% even in stocks at or near retirement. So 20% stocks, that's really, really conservative. That's like hide it under the mattress conservative. And 50% is obviously more balanced, but still on the more conservative side of things. So if you had a higher percentage in stocks, you could actually justify a higher withdrawal rate because your return assumptions are going to be a little bit better over a 30-year retirement compared to a more conservative portfolio where the return assumptions are lower. So that's the first area where you could deviate from that. If you're willing to accept the volatility and you have a bit higher in stocks, like 60%, then you probably can afford to have a higher than a 3.7% withdrawal rate. The other important consideration here is that the assumption, as most withdrawal rate assumptions, includes some sort of inflation component. So the assumption here is that you would start at 3.7%, but then you would increase that 2.3% per year on average for inflation. That's fairly reasonable given the inflation and what it has been since the great financial crisis in 2008. Like, inflation's been pretty low, but more recently, and even since inflation has come down, it's pretty sticky at 3%. So if you were to increase it by the recommended amount here, your income every year in retirement, you're probably not keeping up with inflation. I talked about this before, but there's a lot of structural reasons and long-term demographic reasons why inflation we may not see it go back to 2.5%. It may remain elevated at 3.5% for longer than it has historically. So that's a consideration as well. Now, if you were to spend 3.7% using the parameters outlined by Morningstar here, assuming that you have Social Security as well, and you're going to collect $36,000 from that on $1 million portfolio, that's $37,000 if you're using the 3.7% withdrawal rate, and then you increase it by the 2.3% inflation adjustment every year. So in total, that gives you, with Social Security and what you're spending, $73,000 of income in the first year. And then your lifetime spending, if you project that all the way through a 30-year retirement, would be $2.9 million. And importantly, you started with $1 million, but using these assumptions, you actually had an ending value at the end of your life of $1.33 million. So what if you say, well, I don't want $1 million left over. I'm comfortable with spending down my assets a little bit more. And so if you care less about what that ending balance is at the end of your life and you want to either retire earlier or spend a little bit more, there are other approaches as well. So I think the main takeaway here is that while these analysis and recommendations are useful, you have to apply that to your own specific circumstances. What age are you going to retire? When are you going to start Social Security? What does your investment portfolio look like? How well diversified are you? How much in stocks and bonds and cash do you have? How flexible are you with your spending? I think one of the most important ways to ensure that you're not going to run out of money in retirement is to maintain flexibility. So if you have a great year like we had in 2023 and 2024 and you made money in your portfolio, then you can take a little bit more out of your investments that year. But what if we have a recession and you see your portfolio value drop by 10 or 15 or even 20%? Do you have the flexibility? Do you have the cash savings to be able to significantly reduce or stop your withdrawals in a down year, particularly in the dangerous first 3 to 5 years of retirement where those big downturns are going to hurt you the most? So that's the takeaway, is that you can use it as a guideline and as a starting place. But then from there, you want to make sure that your own particular circumstances and applying that to your withdrawal rate and the amount of income that you're taking out, and make sure that that is sustainable and that you're maintaining some flexibility there too. All right, that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Ashley Michike, and this is the Retirement Quick Tips Podcast.